Hello, listeners. Welcome to this episode of Cryptonomics. Before we jump into today's discussion, please keep in mind this recording is for general education and is not intended to constitute investment advice. Any opinions expressed are those of the participants and do not necessarily represent those of Witham. Hello, listeners. Welcome back to another episode of Cryptonomics, brought to you by Witham. I'm your host, Mark Eckerly, and today I welcome to the show Mackenzie Patel, Senior Revenue Accountant at Figment. So Mackenzie, I'm going to kick it right over to you to give us some background on yourself as well as your company, Figment, and kind of tell us what you guys do.
Sure. Thanks for having me on, Mark. Really excited for this. So as you mentioned, I'm the Senior Revenue Accountant at Figment, and so that means I handle all of our different revenue, whether it's staking revenue, data hub revenue, all of our different product lines. So oversee all of that. I joined Figment over a year ago now, which is pretty crazy. I started off doing more like rewards analysis, like reporting and FP&A, but my background is accounting. So I slowly made my way over to the actual accounting team. And then before Figment, I was actually a revenue accountant over at Honeywell, which is like a manufacturing type of company. I was out in Arizona doing revenue accounting for their aerospace department. So going from jet engines to crypto was very different, but it was a really awesome transition, and I really just fell in love with the crypto space. And so before that, I was attending University of Florida, got my degrees in accounting, and so I've been doing it for about a few years now. In the crypto space specifically, only about a year, but that feels kind of like a long time for crypto.
Yep. Time definitely flies when you're in this space. It's pretty crazy.
I know things move so quickly, and especially like in my world of crypto accounting, there's no guidance, so things tend to shift and change very often. So you really have to stay on top of it.
Well, that's what I was going to ask too. I mean, I'm not going to focus too much on the accounting side, specifically talking about guidance and things like that, but being in the crypto space and applying ASC 606, the new revenue standard, obviously being the new senior revenue accountant, there's definitely some inherent challenges and hurdles there, I'm sure, which was a fun process, I bet, to go through.
Yeah, don't have to get into it in too much detail, but there's the 5-step revenue recognition process, and every single step has challenges in the crypto world, especially with non-custodial staking, which Figment deals with. And so, yeah, it's a whole can of worms.
I'm sure it was exciting.
Yeah, it makes the job very interesting for sure. I always tell people I log on to work and I don't really know what I'm going to do that day because things always change. So yeah. I like that though. It's more my pace.
That's the beauty of the space. So why don't we jump right in? Tell us a little bit about Figment. What's the company doing? What are you guys building? And kind of give us a little bit of background on the company.
Sure. So Figment is a blockchain infrastructure provider. And so first and foremost, we run validators on over 65 proof-of-stake networks now, which is a lot of different chains. And so yeah, protocol infrastructure is definitely one of our main things that we do. So in addition to running validators, we also run different infrastructure related like APIs for blockchain data. So if you're like a blockchain developer and you need data from a specific blockchain, you can access or query one of our nodes and get data that way. And so those are kind of the main things that we're focused on, but it all relates back to blockchain infra, which most people don't really think about or think it's like a not sexy sort of part of crypto, but it is so fundamental and like so necessary because without it, like blockchains wouldn't run. Like validators power the proof of stake ecosystem, and we're a part of that.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, it's not the sexy role, and there's definitely a need there though, because whenever you look at what the openings are in this space, right? Like I myself, we're looking for crypto accountants, crypto auditors, things like that, and people that understand the space rather than a 101 or entry level. The dev position, people building out in the space, those are the hottest commodity by far, right? Understanding how to code and build, understand the technological piece of this, because when it comes to crypto, it's a new space and a new technology, right? I know everyone wants to talk about it as a currency, but it is just such a massive technological change for the ecosystem. It's just a complete new asset class.
Yeah, definitely. And on the engineering side, we have a bunch of DevOps engineers that we call them, the ones that maintain and spin up new validators. And they have to go through a whole like rigorous program basically on how to learn to be a DevOps engineer, because that's not something you just learn in school or that you can just like learn through courses online. Well, maybe you can now, but we have like a very specific sort of training that our engineers go through. Because you're right, it's new. Like I feel like most people are used to like traditional engineering or traditional accounting. But going to Web3, it's completely different. Like I always say that when I was in school, like I think I heard the word blockchain maybe once in one of my classes. It really wasn't mentioned at all. And so like working at Figment, pretty much everything was self-learned because there's like you have to learn it yourself because there's not like a book you can really refer to.
it's trial by fire. They're just going to throw you right in and kind of expect you to know it.
Yeah, a lot of trial and error, that's for sure. That's kind of like the story of my life in Figment. But again, I really like it because it's so much fun just like Googling random like crypto things and like having that be part of your job. So I really enjoy that.
But before we jump into, I know you mentioned it, the staking side of things, right? That's really a core piece of your business, working with those types of protocols. So we're gonna, before we give some background on what that is and ultimately means, as well as ETH 2.0 or the ETH merge that just happened a couple weeks ago, can you give us a little bit of background as to who your core customers are from Figma, right? Is it a service or a product for the average consumer like myself, or is it more of a B2B product where businesses will utilize the technology that your devs are building? Can you kind of tell us a little bit more about the product itself?
Sure. So I think the really cool part is that it caters to both, right? So if you have tokens of a native protocol, let's say I have Atom tokens, Atom's a native token for the Cosmos blockchain. Whether I'm an institutional, like I'm a VC fund, or I'm just an individual that has a few Atom, I can stake them to Figment's validator. And so I think it's I guess democratizing in that way because you don't have to have like a certain amount of capital. Like as long as you have like a single Atom token, like you can go ahead and stake it. And so just to walk you through the flow of like what that would look like. So let's say I'm a retail delegator, for instance. A lot of times you can just do it right through the wallet UI. So in the Cosmos example, there's a wallet called Kepler. And so I can like buy some Atom, let's say on Coinbase or Kraken, send it over to my Kepler wallet, and then my Atom's there. And then there's like a staking feature where you can just go in and then see all the different validators on Cosmos. And then it's super simple. There's like a delegate button basically that you click. And so that way, again, like you don't even have to really understand crypto that much. Definitely recommend it if you are delegating, but it's very easy to do in the UI. And then you can just see your rewards continuously accruing. You can even claim your rewards right within your wallet. And so it's super simple. And that way, like anyone can really delegate if they have like at least enough tokens. And so on the institutional side, it kind of works the same way. The only difference is that the volume is typically much higher. A VC fund's not just going to be staking one Atom; they might be staking like multiple hundreds of thousands of Atom. But the process is fundamentally the same. You're delegating your tokens to the Figment validator, essentially like voting for it, saying, "Hey, I want the Figment validator to represent me when it's proposing and voting on new blocks." And so there's more interaction with like our sales team, for instance, mostly deals with like the higher or the larger institutional customers. And in that sense, it's more B2B. We don't really have interactions with our retail customers beyond like we have a support email if a retail customer like has difficulty staking or something like that. But yeah, we are mostly focused on institutional, but at the same time, like anyone can really stake, which I think is really
it's
cool.
open to it's open to the public.
Exactly. Yeah. And well, that comes with the pros and cons. So, I mean, the good part is that anyone can access it, but then especially as more regulations come down the pipe, like let's say we might have to issue 1099s in the future. Like if I just have a blockchain address, that's a string of alphanumeric characters. I have no idea where this person is. Like, how am I going to issue a 1099 or know where this person is located in the world? So from like a regulatory reporting standpoint, it can get really challenging. But I think just from an overall like access standpoint, it's really liberating. So you get pros and cons there.
Yeah, I was gonna say you're preaching to the choir too, because we see the same thing, right, with a lot of companies that we work with. Because to your point, that's one of the beauties of crypto, right? Is the anonymity piece, right? Like I don't want to give up all my personal identifying information if I don't have to. But that's kind of one of the inherent challenges that we're going to face as a space if we want that regulation and we want to kind of go by the book, right? If we want to do things right and ultimately bring this space forward. It's one of those boxes that we're going to have to check in order to kind of get mass adoption. Right? People don't want to do it, but we're going to have to.
Yeah, because I mean, you still want blockchain users to like be safe, like if they're not financially literate or don't, you don't want people staking their entire like life savings into crypto. Like maybe the regulation is a good thing, but at the same time, I don't really want it to hinder the ethos of Web3, which is like openness and immutability and like all those kind of properties. And so I think we're at a really pivotal point now where we're trying to strike the right balance between regulation and then also like freedom of the technology. So we'll see which way it turns out. Hopefully in a good way.
Fingers crossed. We're all working together on the same team to bring the space forward.
Yeah, exactly.
So one point that you brought up earlier in your explanation was about the Kepler wallet, and I think it's an important distinction to the audience just to understand what that terminology really means, because it's not your standard wallet infrastructure. And ultimately, if a customer is using Kepler, are we giving our assets to Figment? Are you guys taking title to customers' assets? Or what's kind of the background there, the infrastructure from a customer's perspective?
Sure, that's a great question. So at its core, Figment is a non-custodial validator, which means that we don't ever take custody of our customers' assets. So when I'm delegating tokens, let's say Atom, I'm delegating to Figment's validator. Figment isn't ever taking control of my assets. They're still pretty much in my wallet. Think of it as if I'm like voting for Figment's validator when I'm delegating tokens to them. They're not actually taking control at any point. And just to clarify what I mean by Kepler, so think of like MetaMask, but for the Cosmos ecosystem, that's kind of what Kepler is. It's just a hot wallet that holds funds. So yeah, but at no point does a validator ever take control of them.
Yep, perfect, perfect. That's kind of what I envisioned. But again, someone that's coming in new, I haven't used Figment. I was just curious of what that distinction is because, to your point, right? It's with what has transpired this year, that kind of owning your keys, owning your funds has been more critical than ever. And I know that's been like you mentioned, the ethos of crypto, right? Is we want to take title to our funds, own our assets, and kind of bring the responsibility to us as opposed to third parties. So I always like to make that distinction, what the protocol is working on and kind of how the back end is working, because anyone transferring their assets, as we saw in May or June, right? Anyone that had their assets at a Celsius, BlockFi, obviously it didn't affect them as much, but Celsius, Voyager, companies like that, where you were getting that lending interest, people may have thought using those platforms that they had title to those assets, but they really weren't there. So always like to make that distinction as best as possible.
Yeah, and I think as a user, it is important to know always where your funds are being held and who actually controls them. So if it's in a wallet that you hold the private keys to, then you can have more comfort there because you know you hold those assets. But you can also stake through a custodian, which in a lot of cases, custodians actually do have your private keys. And so they might have control over your funds that you are staking then. And so in that case, like you don't have as much control, but then you also have the benefits of being with the custodian, which is more of like traditional type of infrastructure. So it can kind of go both ways, but in the Figment model where it's non-custodial staking, then the assets are yours.
Perfect. Perfect. Awesome. So jumping into staking now, can you give us a quick 101 as to what proof of stake is versus proof of work? And kind of dive into what the staking ecosystem really is and the value proposition there.
Yeah, definitely. So I always love explaining this because I think it's so interesting, like talking about the differences between both of these systems. So I'll start off with proof of work. So I think that one's a little more, people might know that a little bit more because of Bitcoin, for example, uses proof of work. And so in that system, it's pretty much you have these actors called miners, and they're competing to solve complex math problems that are only increasing in difficulty. And so in this way, the chain in a proof of work consensus mechanism is secured by energy. And when I mean energy, like computation power, electricity, because the servers that are running these calculations, they're called GPUs, they just take a lot of energy to solve these math problems. And so that's kind of the core of how the network is secured. It's by energy. And so in proof of work, the miners are all competing because they want to mint new tokens, like for example, new Bitcoin. But in that case, it does require a lot of capital to get started. Like you have to buy the servers, like the mining rigs, all those kinds of things. And so that's why it's just like very capital intensive and again, also very energy intensive. And so what happens is that in proof of work, you can also get kind of centralized because the different mining pools can form together. And so it's just a way for them to share resources and then share in the rewards as well. And so that's sort of the proof of work model. Now, proof of stake is actually quite different. I think they reach sort of the same goal, which is having a secured blockchain, but they reach that in very different ways. So in a proof of stake world, it's being secured by users' assets. So users have tokens from the native protocol, and then they're locking them up or they're staking them to the blockchain. So in that way, that the blockchain is being secured not by like electricity or energy, but basically by assets, by like financial capital, which I think is, really interesting. It's definitely more energy efficient. You don't have to run like a bunch of mining rigs. You just have to stake assets. And so there's a different ecosystem or different players that are involved in this ecosystem. So just wanted to get into that a little bit. So you have the validators. For example, Figment is a validator. And then you have delegators, which are staking their tokens over to the validators. And so just to clarify that a bit, the validator's role is to basically look at transactions that people are submitting, make sure that they're legitimate, bundle them into blocks, and then add those blocks to the blockchain. And so you have this really rich ecosystem that develops. And in exchange for doing this work, the protocol rewards the validators and the delegators for basically making sure that the network is secure and that the transactions are valid. And so that's kind of the difference between the two models. I know people sort of focus on the energy aspect a lot, which is really important, but they're just fundamentally different. Like one's being secured by energy, one's being secured by assets. And so hopefully that gives a good overview. It gets way more complex than that, but I think that's a good high level overview.
One follow up I have there is to just kind of understand the possibility of centralization. Because I know you touched on it with proof of work, and my counter argument to that would be yes, there are 100%. I agree with you with the POW system. There could be mining farms around the world. I know we had some centralization before China ultimately banned it. I know China was kind of becoming a large player in that space.
Right.
My counter argument to that would be within a proof of stake ecosystem, couldn't you set up kind of liquidity pools, like staking pools, and kind of centralize the landscape from that perspective, like as well? Like, couldn't a Coinbase or a Kraken aggregate all of their users' assets, assuming that they ultimately stake them? But couldn't that become a large player within the ecosystem, kind of forming some type of centralization as well?
Yeah, I think that's a really strong counterpoint. I mean, you do get situations where you have really large validators, which I think is what you're talking about, that aggregate a bunch of stake. And so in that case, maybe on a network, you have like the top 10 validators control like 80% of the staked assets or something like that. And so that definitely is the case. My counter argument to that, though, is that those assets that are being staked, like that could be composed of like thousands upon thousands of individual delegators. And so their stake might be rolling up into like a Coinbase or a Kraken node, but when you get down to it, it's actually like thousands of individuals that are staking their assets to the protocol. So it's kind of like they're being bundled up versus like seeing them in a disaggregated way. So does that make sense?
Yeah, so they're being bundled up to get the incentive from a rewards perspective, but they all have a vote if there are any changes to the protocol or anything like that. So everyone's vote counts. It's almost taking an analogy to almost like our democracy here with a state perspective, right? Like each state has their registered voters within the Senate, right? Their representation as far as their votes in the Electoral College. And that's kind of like how you pull their assets together for a vote, right? I'm trying to make an analogy here to an extent where your vote becomes part of a larger pool.
Yeah, I think that works. I do think of staking almost like a representative democracy, but I also will say that I think the delegators have a little bit more control because as a delegator, your token then has rights. Like you have governance rights. So there's proposals that are coming through. As a delegator, like you can vote on that individually. Like me, if I'm delegating, I can vote on whatever proposal. If I don't vote, usually the way it works in those protocols is that like your vote defaults to whatever your validator voted. But as a delegator, you still have the option to vote whatever way you want. Mm-hmm. It's just if you don't vote, like if you don't participate, then it defaults to the validator. So you actually have a little bit more control in that sense, I think, because you still have the option to vote on like every proposal if you really wanted to.
Regardless of the size of your asset pool, right? 100%.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you're staking one atom, then like your weight's gonna be like one, basically. Versus
well, yeah, that's just the inherent.
Yeah, that does play into it.
Mm-hmm. So talk to us about the merge transition from Ethereum, right? The Ethereum network recently transitioned from a proof of work concept or consensus model to the proof of stake. And after doing a bunch of research, obviously following this very closely, we're both in this space, there was seamlessly no hiccup in the protocol as it made the transition, which was extremely impressive to me. I kind of expected there to be delays, update issues, something, and it happened like the drop of a hat, which was crazy. So tell us a little bit about that, how it happened, how it went down, and kind of how the system is doing today, right? Making such a massive protocol update to the network. I think it's the biggest one that it's ever went through by far. Mm-hmm. Talk to us about what's going on with it.
Sure. Yeah, it's definitely super exciting. And at Figment, we were obviously very excited because it's going from proof of work over to proof of stake. So really big milestone for Ethereum community and also at Figment. And so I also expected something to happen. You know, it's been kind of a rough year for crypto. So I was like, oh, this would be like the cherry on top if like Ethereum went down or something like that. But yeah, it went over pretty smoothly on, I think it was September 15th that it happened. So yeah, basically the consensus mechanism switched over from proof of work to proof of stake. That's what the merge is referring to. Ethereum actually has like a whole schedule of upgrades that are planning to happen. So first one was the beacon chain being launched. The second one was the merge. And then I think there's some more like scalability and sharding updates that are coming up in the future. And so this milestone was just the merge. And so there were a few important things that kind of came out of this. The first one, and the one that people are talking about a lot, was, again, the energy consumption. And so I think Vitalik had a tweet, let me find, he said like worldwide electricity consumption was reduced by 0.2%, which is really amazing. Like, go Ethereum. So yeah, it's definitely a lot more energy efficient now. It's also really expensive to attack Ethereum's network now. So in a proof of stake model, the cost to attack is pretty much like greater than the number of tokens being staked, like converted to USD. So right now there's around, I think, let's see, like 13 billion ETH being staked, or 13 million ETH being staked. And so total value that's locked in Ethereum now is around 18 billion. So basically you need more than $18 billion to execute a 51% attack on Ethereum. So the network is like super secure. I mean, I think it's still secure under the proof of work model, because proof of work just inherently tends to be very secure, because you need, basically, if you want to attack the network, you have to have more energy consumption than anyone else. But I think it's just a cool stat to say, you need $18 billion to attack.
The only two people that can do it are Elon Musk or like Jeff Bezos.
Basically, if they colluded, then we might be in trouble. But hopefully that doesn't happen. So I think they like crypto though, so I think we're safe there. But yeah, and the merge basically is at the stage for sharding, as I mentioned. Sharding is just a term that refers to like breaking data up into more of like a database format, or basically like splitting up a database, and that is supposed to help Ethereum become more scalable, more efficient. And so the merge kind of laid the groundwork for that later update. Now, I did want to get into some cons as well, because the merge was awesome, but there's still, proof of stake isn't all like rosy, I guess I will say. But on the con side, you do need a large amount of capital to participate in this. And so we didn't mention before that proof of stake, like you just need a lot of tokens, and those tokens might be expensive. So to run your own Ethereum validator, you need to stake 32 ETH, which at the price of over like $1,300 now can be pretty pricey and pretty out of reach. And so it's just kind of expensive to have your own validator. Now, that being said, there are things like Lido, which is like liquid staking or rocket pool. So if you have less than 32 ETH, you can still get access to staking on Ethereum and get rewards back in ST ETH. So there is kind of a counter to that, but it's just like an extra step you have to do to participate. And then with staking, this isn't specific to Ethereum, but any proof of stake networks, there is slashing. So if the validator misbehaves, like it double signs or like has a problem with attestation, then you can be slashed, which means a portion of your principal is basically like taken away from you. And so that is a concern. Slashing isn't as much of a thing on proof of work. If you misbehave in proof of work, you just kind of like wasted money, like wasted energy basically. Whereas in proof of stake, you just get slashed.
Yeah, I was gonna say that's the inherent risk you run, right? If you're being a bad actor, or if your validator, something's not up and running properly, right? That's the staking mechanism, right? You lose your stake to an extent.
Exactly. It's literally the way the system is designed. Like all of these systems are based on incentives and like very complex incentive designs. And so it's designed in the way to encourage like optimal behavior and optimal activity, which it's so cool. Like blockchains are like little mini universes, that you can just sort of orchestrate and put incentives on top, which I think is really interesting.
And that brings me to my next point. So talking about the pros and cons of the ETH network and kind of what just happened, and now there's obviously a ton of other networks doing this, right? So Ethereum's not the first proof of stake network, excuse me. So what other ecosystems are working in this space with a similar model? And then what other kind of blockchain technologies does Figment work with as well? Where else are you guys set up as validators?
Yeah, so we're on, as I mentioned, like over 65 proof of stake networks, which is a lot. And so the model we're seeing is definitely like when new networks launch, they tend to be proof of stake. Now, like there are some proof of work networks still, but I think kind of the general trend within blockchain is moving to proof of stake. And so we're on a bunch of different layer ones, like Ethereum was just, one of them, but we're on other ones like Near or Flow or Oasis. We're on a bunch of Cosmos-based networks. I personally think Cosmos is just like the coolest ecosystem. If you haven't heard of it, I'd looked into the Cosmos SDK, but basically it's like this kit that allows you to spin up a blockchain really easily using the software development kit. And so on the Cosmos networks,
do I have to know how to code in order to do that?
If you want to,
or is it very user friendly?
I don't think it's a no code. The Cosmos key is not like a no code tool. I wish it was, or else I'd create my own like blockchain. So you do have to know some coding, but it does make it a lot easier than trying to do it from scratch, is my understanding. And so Figment operates on, I want to say like 15 to 20, don't quote me on the exact number, like Cosmos-based networks, but they're really awesome. They all have like their own function, like they're all separate layer ones, but they all do like their own things. So like Juno does smart contracts, the Crescent does like liquid staking, and there's a bunch of them out there. And so the reason why I think they're so interesting though is because they have something called IBC, or inter-blockchain communication, because that's a fun term. And so basically, if these blockchains have IBC turned on, you can send these tokens to like all the different blockchains out there. So like, let's say I own tokens, or I earn tokens on Juno, I can send them over to Osmosis, which is a decentralized exchange that runs on Cosmos. I can swap it out for Atom tokens, and I can take this Atom that I now have on Osmosis. I can IBC it over to the Cosmos blockchain, and from there I can off ramp it and like sell it for USD if I wanted. And so it's a really cool, like rich ecosystem. And I just like how it's like all connected. I think they call it the Internet of Blockchains. And I can definitely see why they call it that, just because like it's a whole web basically. And yeah, it's really fun to participate in.
You took the words out of my mouth. I was just going to say, that's what I think is one of the next steps in this space, because I'm sure, as you're saying, like if Figment is on 65 different protocols and blockchains, and people's heads are probably exploding. Like, holy yeah, I know Bitcoin and ETH, and I'll leave it at that. But the cross-chain optionality or functionality is going to be critical in this space to help grow it. And the fact that Cosmos network kind of does that, right? It's all, like you mentioned, it's one universe in and of itself, right? Mm-hmm. They all speak to each other, but they're all acting and working distinct in and of themselves. But I really think that's going to be a huge kind of driver in this space to really bring it to that next level, is getting that cross-chain operability.
Yeah, I definitely think so as well. And at Figment, we really do believe in what we call like a multi-chain future. I mean, maybe one blockchain will win out, but we kind of hope that it's split amongst different blockchains that have different teams behind them, like different communities and ecosystems. Because there's so many things you can do in Web3 that we probably haven't even conceptualized yet. And I don't think it's just going to be like one blockchain that like one winner take all kind of thing. I think there's going to be separate blockchains that like have their own function, and they do it really well, but then they can communicate to all the other chains. Now, one point I will say on that, like, we are seeing like blockchains start to talk to each other through bridging or like bridges, but bridges do tend to be a little bit risky. There's been a lot of bridge hacks recently. You might have heard of like the wormhole hack or Nomad. There was like another hack as well. And so the technology is still sort of catching up there. So it is a little bit risky to use those types of technologies, but I think they will improve.
And I agree as well. I mean, I think there's not going to be one that wins out. There's definitely going to be a couple. I don't think we're going to end up with all the tokens that we have now. Right, there's like over 20,000 tokens, and yeah, I mean, space is getting crazy. Right, it's gonna get narrowed down, and you're gonna weed out some of those useless tokens. But there's going to be more than one, and there's going to be various use cases for sure, 100%. And to your point, right, where regulation is taking forever, and it's one thing we need for this space, but the space is constantly evolving, and we're constantly growing. Like, we're not waiting for regulation. We're not waiting for guidance. We're just going to keep building and building. And there's going to be things that we haven't even thought of today that, who knows, in a year from now, we'll be talking about.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah. I still think we're in it's almost like the early days of the internet, where people were just like copying text onto a web page, and then they thought that was all the internet was going to be. Like, I guess it was very like the terms like skeuomorphic. So I think we're still in the skeuomorphic days of blockchain. We haven't really realized the full potential of it yet, because we just can't really conceptualize it.
It's like we're still taking notes in Notepad. Like, that's exactly. Wait till we get to the next level of something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so excited to see what happens with that. I think it's gonna be really, really cool.
Awesome. Well, that wraps up my questions that I had. I think today was a great episode. Mackenzie, why don't you tell our listeners where they can find you, kind of plug your socials, as well as more about the company.
Sure. Yeah. So on the Figment site, you can go to figment.io. All of our information is there. We're also on Twitter. I think it's Figment_IO. So you can find us there. And then personally, you can find me on Twitter. My handle is Figgy_feline, because I like Figment and I like cats. So you can go ahead and find me there.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. And that wraps up today's episode of Cryptonomics. All views expressed in this podcast by Mark Eckerly or his guests are solely their opinions and do not reflect the opinion of Witham. This podcast is for informational purposes only.